Imagine being the architect of an ancient castle, not just any castle, but the one that will be remembered through the ages. You lay down the stones, build the walls, and raise the towers. It's solid, functional, yet it lacks personality, color, life. That's where your next role comes in, becoming the master artist who breathes life into this structure. You're about to learn the secrets of CSS. Magic that adds color to the walls, intricacy to the banners, and texture to the paths. It's like picking up a brush and painting your imagination across the castle, transforming it from a mere structure to a storybook masterpiece. The syntax is pretty straightforward. It's like giving instructions to a painter about what colors to use on different parts of your castle. A basic CSS rule looks like this. The selector is how you tell CSS which part of your HTML castle you want to style. If you want to style all paragraphs, you can use P as your selector. The property is the specific aspect you want to change, like the color of the walls or the size of the windows. And the value is the specific setting you want to apply to the property, like blue for color or 16 pixels for size. But did you know you can do so much more with these? Don't worry, I'll tell you everything I know. Let's start with selectors. Selectors are like pointing fingers. You can point at one specific thing, like a single tower of your castle, by using an ID, or at all similar structures, like all battlements, using a class. There are a bunch of ways to point at things, including by their type, like all paragraphs, or even based on their relationship with other elements. Here are a few you can get acquainted with, which will be more than enough to start your journey. Type selector. This is the simplest form. You target elements by their type, like P for paragraph, H1 for top-level headers, or div for divisions, and so on. Class selector. This one allows you to target elements by a class attribute in your HTML. For example, .menuItem could be a class you've assigned to each item in your website's navigation bar. ID selector. When you want to style a very specific element and nothing else, you use an ID selector, like #maingate. IDs are unique. You should only use each one once per page. Attribute selector. This targets elements based on an attribute they have, like type equals text to style all text input fields. Pseudo-class selector. These are used to define a special state of an element. For instance, :hover applies styles to an element when the mouse hovers over it. Pseudo-element selector. This allows you to style specific parts of an element, like : first letter, to style the first letter of a paragraph. Descendant selector. This is used to select an element that is inside another element, specified by a space. For example, nav space li would target all li elements that are inside a nav element. Child selector. Similar to the descendant selector, but more specific. It targets only direct children of an element, using the greater than symbol. UL greater than li targets li elements that are direct children of UL elements, not li elements deeper within. Adjacent sibling selector. This selector targets an element that is immediately preceded by a specific element, using the plus symbol. For example, H1 plus P styles a paragraph directly following an H1. General sibling selector. A bit looser than the adjacent sibling selector. It uses the tilde symbol to target all siblings of an element that match the selector, not just the next one. Selectors can be combined and layered in complex ways to precisely target exactly what you want to style, offering a powerful toolset for crafting your website's look and feel. Just remember, with great power comes great responsibility to keep your CSS organized and readable. Properties and values. Imagine we're now looking at a detailed blueprint of our castle, discussing how to bring it to life with color and texture. In CSS, properties and values work together like paint and brushes in an artist's kit, allowing you to specify exactly how you want each part of your web page to look. Properties. Properties are the main aspect of the elements you can style. Think of them as the characteristics of the castle you can modify. Here are some of the most commonly used properties. Color. This property changes the color of the text inside an element. Background color. Sets the background color of an element. Font size. Adjusts the size of the text. Border. Adds a border around elements. Padding. The space between an element's border and its content. Margin. The space around elements, outside of any defined borders. Width and height. These properties set the size of the elements. Font family specifies the typeface used for text within an element. If you want to know more about how the border, padding, margin, width and height works, I've got a guide dedicated to just those properties called the CSS Box Model. You'll find a link to it at the end of the video. Values. Values specify the settings for the properties. They are the specifics of the modifications you are making, like the exact shade of blue for your banners or the thickness of your walls. Values can be keywords. These are predefined words that have specific meanings in CSS, like red for the color red or solid for a solid border. Lengths. You can specify sizes in CSS using units like pixels, px, ems, em, or percentages. For example, font size 40px sets the text size to 40 pixels, while width 50% makes an element take up half of its parent's element's width. Colors. Colors can be specified using names, hex codes, RGB values, or HSL values. URLs. For properties like background image. The value can be a URL pointing to an image file that you want to display. Combining properties and values. In your CSS, you combine properties and values into declarations, which are then grouped into rule sets based on the selectors you're using to target elements. Here's a simple example. This CSS rule tells the browser to paint all paragraph text blue and set the font size to 40 pixels. By mastering the art of combining different properties and values, you can craft intricate, visually compelling websites. Much like how combining different architectural elements and colors can turn a simple castle into a breathtaking palace. Enjoy experimenting and seeing what amazing designs you can create. The cascading part. CSS is cascading because styles can overlap and inherit from each other. Kind of like if you decided your castle's battlements should all be blue, but then said the main gate's battlement should be gold. Gold styling for the gate battlement takes precedence because it's more specific, but other battlements remain blue. The box model is a fundamental concept in web development that describes how every element on a web page is represented as a rectangular box. This model details how the size of boxes or elements is calculated and how they interact with each other on the page. Each box consists of 4 distinct parts. Content, the area where text, images, or other elements are displayed. Padding, the space between the content and the border. Padding is inside the box and increases the space within the box itself. Border, a visible outline that surrounds the padding and the content. It is a part of the outer dimensions of the box. Margin, the space outside the border. It separates the box from neighboring elements. The total size of an element is calculated by adding up the content's width and height, padding, borders, and margins. The content size is primarily controlled by the width and height properties of an element. These properties directly affect the size of the content area, but do not include padding, borders, or margins. Padding is the space between the content and the border. You can adjust padding using the padding property. It can be set for all 4 sides simultaneously or individually for the top, right, bottom, and left sides. You can also use the padding property as a shorthand for top, right, bottom, and left. Borders are used to define the outline of an element. You can control their style, width, and color using CSS properties. The border style property defines the style of the border. You can set this to dotted, dashed, solid, double, groove, ridge, inset, and outset. The absence of this property means no border will be displayed. The border width property specifies the thickness of the border. You can use different units like pixels, percentages, and rem. The border color property sets the color of the border. You can use color names, hex codes, or RGB values. You can specify all of these properties individually for each side of the box, top, right, bottom, and left, or use shorthand properties to set them all at once. The border radius CSS property is used to round the corners of an element's border, transforming sharp edges into smooth, rounded ones. It can accept 1 to 4 values to specify the radii of all 4 corners individually, or use a single value to uniformly round all corners. Additionally, border radius can define elliptical corners by specifying 2 sets of values for horizontal and vertical radii, separated by a slash. This property not only applies to the borders, but also affects the element's background, enabling the creation of elements with rounded edges or fully circular shapes, enhancing the visual aesthetics and user interface design of a web page. Margin is the space outside the border. It separates the element from other elements. Margins can be set to all 4 sides simultaneously or individually, and you can also use the shorthand property for top, right, bottom and left. By default, the width and height you specify for an element apply only to the content box. If you add padding and borders, they increase the overall dimensions of the element. The box sizing CSS property can alter this behavior. By default, the content box is used. This means that the width and height include only the content. The border box means the width and height include the content, padding and border, but not the margin. To make the sizing more intuitive, especially when adding padding and borders, you can set the box sizing to border box. This way, the width and height you specify will always be the total size of the element, including content, padding and borders, making it easier to size elements precisely. Combining your knowledge of the box model and the border styling can dramatically improve the look and feel of your web pages. Here's an example that incorporates all 3 concepts. With these CSS rules, we define an element with specific dimensions, padding, and we apply a solid blue border around it. Experimenting with these properties will help you understand their impact and how they work together to create visually appealing designs.
In Flexbox we have flex items, which are the direct children of a flex container. We can use these to configure a dynamic and flexible layout. To create a flex container we need to add display flex to the CSS properties of an element. In Flexbox we have a main axis, which is the primary direction our flex items will arrange themselves inside a flex container. Perpendicular to the main axis we have the cross axis. You can change the direction of these axes by adding a property to the flex container called flex direction. By default, flex direction is set to row, which means that the main axis is left to right and the cross axis is top to bottom. You can change the flex direction to row reverse, which arranges our flex items from right to left, column, which arranges our flex items top to bottom, and column reverse, which arranges our flex items from bottom to top. We set the flex direction back to default and open our code editor. To arrange flex items in the main axis, we use justify content, which by default is set to flex start, but can be changed to flex end, center, space between, which gives the flex items even gaps towards other flex items, space around, which gives every flex item even space to the left and right of the flex item, and space evenly, which arranges all gaps to be of equal size. To arrange flex items in the cross axis, we use align items. By default, this property is set to stretch, which stretches our flex items when we don't have a set height. In align items, we can choose between flex start, flex end, and center. A flex item can be specified to have an alignment of its own. This is done by setting the align self property on a specific flex item. The align self property can have the same values as align items, except for the stretch value. When we start to get a lot of flex items in our design, we might see the flex items overflow the contents of the flex container. This is because the flex wrap property is by default set to no wrap. By changing this to wrap, we get the overflowing flex items on a new row. As we can see, there is some space between the rows that are created from wrapping flex items. We can adjust this using the align content property. By default, it is set to normal, but we can change it to flex start, flex end, center, space between, space around, and space evenly. With align content set to flex start, we can easily see what happens if we try out the gap property. which gives us full control of the spacing between the flex items. Flexbox shrinks your flex items to the width value min content. By default, a flex item with no width has the value max content, which lets the content of the flex item decide how wide it will be. The flex items can be adjusted in the main axis direction by a few properties that go directly on the flex item. Flex shrink controls if the flex item is allowed to shrink or not. The default is set to 1, which means it will shrink if there is not enough space. You can turn this off by setting it to 0. With flex grow, we can adjust how much the flex item will grow. If we give it a value above 0, it will grow relatively to other flex items based on what values we use. The default is 0, which means it will not be growing. Flex basis tells the flex item how much space it should try to take before growing and shrinking. In this case, we've set it to 100 pixels, but we can give it any value like 200 pixels or percentages and so on. Flex is short for these three properties. You can, for example, write flex 100 pixels, 1 and a 0, which means flex basis 100 pixels, flex grow 1 and flex shrink 0. In CSS Grids we have grid items, which are the direct children of a grid container. We create one by adding the property display grid to an element. This will stretch and shrink the grid items when we specify the columns and rows. The grid items will position themselves in tracks, which is the common name for columns and rows throughout the video. To define columns, we can use the property grid template columns, which will allow us to specify a width for every column by separating them with a space. We can define rows with the property grid template rows in the same pattern as we did with columns. In CSS Grids we have fractions, which let us divide columns and rows responsively. If the total space of a grid container is 100%, we divide that by the amount of fractions we have defined. We can use the helper function min-max to define the min and max size of a track. This will shrink your track to the min value when other tracks want more space and lets it stretch to the max value when there is space. Repeat is a helper function you can use to create repetitive tracks and to avoid unnecessarily long definitions. To make a track take up the rest of the space, set it to auto. Every track lie between grid lines. By default, these start from 1 and increase by 1 from left to right and top to bottom. We can also reference these in the reverse order by using negative values. We can use these lines to set a specific start and end to our grid item. One nifty trick is to name the lines you are going to use, which makes it easy to remember when our layout becomes more complex. We use the properties grid column start and grid column end to position the grid item left to right. Grid row start and grid row end positions them in the top to bottom axis. If we just want the grid item to be 2 columns wide and don't care where it starts, we can use the span keyword. For grid template rows and grid template columns, we can use the shorthand property grid template, which first takes rows, then we add a slash, and then add our columns. We can shorten the grid row start and grid row end with the property grid row. We put a start number or name of a grid line first, a slash, and then the end number or name of a grid line. The property grid template areas can name areas within the grid. We can use this to easily position a grid item in the right place. We do this by creating a miniature of the grid in the property. To leave an empty space, we can add a dot. We get implicit tracks when our grid items can't fit in our explicit rows and columns. We can control these by using the grid auto flow property. By default, this is set to row, but we can change it to column, row dense, which tells the grid to fill holes with our overflowing grid items before adding them to implicit rows, and column dense, which tells the grid to fill holes and otherwise add them in an implicit column. We can set the size of the implicit rows and columns with the property grid auto rows and grid auto columns. To manipulate the space between our rows and columns, we can use the column gap and row gap property. When our grid is a set width and our columns isn't taking up the entire space of the grid container, we can use justify content to move the columns to start, end, center, space between, which gives the tracks even gaps towards other tracks, space around, which gives every track even space to the left and right, and space evenly, which arranges all gaps to be of equal size. The same goes for the rows, where we can use the align content property to arrange the rows with the same values as we had with justify content. We can arrange grid items inside their columns with justify items. The default is stretch, but we can also set it to start, end, and center. The same goes in the other direction, where we can use align items. Grid items can arrange themselves by using the properties justify self and align self.
Do you want to make amazing website animations? I will explain everything you need to know to make your own animations, and then we will apply this knowledge to transform this static, but I guess okay, website into a place of wonder. Let's dig into it. CSS Animations enable you to create complex animations that progress through multiple styles over time. They are defined using the @keyframes rule, which allows you to specify the styles at various points during the animation. You can control the timing, duration, and other aspects of the animation using animation properties, but more on those later. The @keyframes rule in CSS Animations is incredibly powerful, allowing for detailed specification of an animation's behavior at various stages of its execution. You are not limited to just the start or from and end or to points. You can specify any number of intermediate steps called keyframes to create complex animations. You can insert any number of keyframes between 0% and 100% to alter the animation's progression. Each keyframe can define the CSS properties to apply at that specific point in the animation timeline. This example demonstrates one animation that changes the background color of an element through multiple colors over 4 seconds. The transform property in CSS is used to apply geometric transformations to an element, such as moving, scaling, rotating, or skewing. There are a ton of things you can do with the transform property, but here is a short description of the most common ones. Translate moves an element horizontally and vertically. Scale scales an element by a specified factor in the horizontal and vertical directions. If you specify only one value, it scales both directions equally. Rotate rotates an element clockwise from its current position. This example moves the element 50 pixels to the right and 100 pixels down from its original position, and then rotates it 40 degrees clockwise. The transform property is often used in conjunction with animations and transitions to create more dynamic and visually appealing effects. By combining @keyframes animations or transitions with transformations, you can create complex, smooth animations that enhance the user interface of a web page. For instance, you could animate an element to move across the screen while simultaneously rotating and scaling up. If you like the content, please like and subscribe for more content like this. An element will not be animating anything until we have applied animation properties to it. And there are a boatload, each serving a specific purpose in defining how the animation behaves. Here's a quick overview of the main animation properties. Animation name specifies the name of the @keyframes animation that should be applied to the element. Animation duration determines the length of time that an animation takes to complete one cycle. It's defined in seconds with S or milliseconds with ms. Animation timing function defines the speed curve of the animation, which controls how the animation progresses through its duration. Common values include linear, ease, ease in, ease out, and ease in, out. Animation delay sets a delay before the animation starts, allowing you to offset when an animation begins. Like duration, it's specified in seconds or milliseconds. Animation iteration count determines how many times the animation repeats. It can be a specific number or the keyword infinite for an endless loop. Animation direction specifies whether the animation should play forwards, backwards, or alternate between playing forwards and backwards on successive iterations. Common values include normal, reverse, alternate, and alternate reverse. Animation fill mode determines the style of the element when the animation is not playing, before it starts, after it ends, or both. Values include none, forwards, backwards, and both, affecting how an element should be styled at those times. Animation play state allows you to pause and resume the animation. It accepts paused and running as values. These properties can be used individually or combined in a shorthand animation property, which allows you to specify all the animation properties in a single line, making your CSS cleaner and more concise. This example combines multiple animation properties into one line. It uses the example keyframes animation, has a duration of 2 seconds, an ease in and out timing function, a 1 second delay before starting, repeats infinitely, alternates direction, and applies styles from both the start and end keyframes outside the animation. I would love to hear about all the cool things you guys are making with CSS Animations. Please let me know what you're working on in the comments. The CSS transitions are simpler ways to create animations that change from one style to another over a specified duration. They're perfect for simpler animations, like changing the color of a button on Hover. Let's go through the key parts of the property. Transition property specifies the CSS property to animate. Transition duration defines how long the transition takes. Transition timing function specifies how the transition moves over time and can be set to the different ease keywords. Transition delay delays the start of the transition. We can use the shorthand property transition to set all these properties quickly. This example changes the button's background color to red when hovered over, taking 0.5 seconds to complete the change. Scroll animations occur when you scroll through a web page. With CSS, it's a bit tricky to trigger animations directly on scroll without JavaScript, but you can use CSS to define the animation and then use JavaScript to apply them when certain scroll conditions are met. For beginners, a simple way to start is by using a library like AOS, Animate on Scroll, which simplifies the process. However, to understand the fundamentals, here's how you might approach it with vanilla JavaScript. First, set up your CSS animations or transitions as you would normally. Use JavaScript to detect when the user has scrolled to a certain point in the page. Once the scroll point is reached, add a class to the element you want to animate. This class should be associated with the desired animation or transition. This example sets up a transition that changes the element's opacity. The JavaScript then listens for a scroll event and checks the position of the element class. If the element is in the viewport, it adds the visible class, triggering the CSS transition to make the element fade in. Alright, let's apply this stuff on a website. I prepared the basics of the website. All we need to do is work with the CSS and some JavaScript. Let's begin by adding a nice animation when the user loads the page. For this example, I want to put a focus on the word tomorrow. So if we hop into the HTML, we can see that it has a span with the class tomorrow. What we can do is use this squiggly line I have here and slide in the text tomorrow in a red color. The tomorrow class has a relative positioning to it, so we can create an after pseudo class and add our animation in there. We add the text tomorrow and add the squiggly line as a background image. Put the red color on the text and then align the content. Let's call the animation tomorrow and make it half a second long. Wait for half a second to let the user load the page before starting the animation. For the keyframes, let's start with 0 in opacity and give it a translate of -60%. The animation should end with a translate property centering our content and giving it an opacity of 1. Save it, and nice! The button looks kinda meh, so let's give it some life. In the HTML we can see it has the class CTA button. If we can find it in the CSS file, we can see it's also relatively positioned, which means we can put an after pseudo class here as well. This time we don't need any text, just a red box should be enough. Top it off with a transition property where we tell it that we want it to animate all possible properties and do it over 0.2 seconds. Let's update the after pseudo class on Hover with a bigger width. Save it, and looks good. If we scroll down a bit, we can see this content. Let's make it fade in using these fancy new scroll animations we've just learned. First, we'll find the classes we're working with, then make them invisible for starters and add a class that will be added by our JavaScript. Hop over to the JavaScript and add one script for each of the classes that we've just tweaked. Save it, and lovely. If we scroll down to the bottom, we see another button we need to take care of. But now we know the process quite well, right? Find the class, add a pseudo after class that creates a red box, make it wider on hover, save it, and bam! Beautiful! Check out my other videos for more guides. Thanks, bye!